She counted the money out on the pine boards of the land office in Silver Fork before the clerk had even lifted his pen. $17 in coins, a folded deed passed down from her mother, and a small pewter cup that had held her father's cold coffee on the morning he did not come home from the ridge. That was the entire fortune of Iris Callum, 22 years old, orphaned twice, and about to sign her name to a valley the county surveyor had, in official ink, marked barren. No timber worth cutting, no grass worth grazing, no visible water within the described boundary. The men at the counter laughed the way men laugh when they think a woman does not know what a rock looks like. One of them, a broad-shouldered surveyor's assistant named Halden Poole, told her she had bought herself a very expensive summer of regret. Another, a wool merchant named Deacon Ross, said that the last homesteader to run cattle across that ground had walked out in the spring with 2 dead mules and a wife who would not speak. What they did not know, and what she would not know herself for another 4 months, was that under the ledge above her south fence line, under a limestone shelf the surveyor's map had drawn as a single blank contour, there was water. A great slow chamber of it. Old water, coming up cold and clean through a fissure the last mapping party had walked directly over without noticing. Enough water to keep 3 ranches, for orchards, and a whole town's small hopeful garden alive through a summer that would eventually be remembered as the driest in half a century. Hit that like button and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. Follow along because this one's going to stay with you. Day 1 of the barren valley began an hour before sunrise, with a lantern that had belonged to her mother, and a wagon that Halden Poole had grudgingly allowed her to rent for the day, on the condition, he said, that she return it before she was disappointed. Nobody rode out with her that first morning. Nobody offered to. The mule that pulled the borrowed wagon was a broke-nosed animal named Rowan who had, according to the man who owned him, once thrown a preacher off a wagon board on a Sunday for reasons the preacher had never satisfactorily explained. The wagon itself was a scarred pine buckboard with one wheel that squeaked at a specific pitch on cold mornings and quieted after the first mile. Iris sat on the board with her back straight and her ledger already open to a fresh page across her knees, and the ledger's fresh page said, in her own steady hand, April 4th, 1889. Callum Valley. Deeded and paid. Silver Fork itself did not, on that morning, watch her go. Silver Fork was a town of fewer than 400 souls that had already decided, by the time she rode out at 6:10, that she was a woman about whom nothing further needed to be said. Merritt Vane at the general store had watched from behind the counter without opening the door. The sheriff, Amos Dell, had been at his desk with the door open and had looked up once when the wagon passed. That was the entirety of Silver Fork's witnessing. The rest of it was pale sun and cold air and one bird calling somewhere on the roof of the livery. She had, on the ride south the previous winter, memorized the shape of the ridge lines from a lithographed county map pinned to the wall of the boarding house in the town where she had been staying, and she had drawn the shape from memory on the last page of her ledger, and the shape as it appeared in front of her now, at the top of the low bluff above the valley, matched the shape she had drawn to the nearest quarter of a mile. The pale ridge on the north side, the red-shot ridge on the south, the saucer of pale ground between. Nothing else within 20 miles. Day 1. The road out of Silver Fork ran east through prairie so pale it hurt the eyes, and then broke against a line of low bluffs the color of old bone. Iris drove the borrowed wagon with the reins wound once around her left wrist the way her father had taught her, in case the mule spooked, and one hand kept flat on the pine chest at her side. The chest held everything she owned that was not on her back. 3 cotton dresses, 1 wool skirt, a canvas apron double-stitched at the pockets, her father's whetstone, her mother's Bible, a bundle of dried thyme sewn into a linen bag, a copper measuring cup, a small pewter cup, a folded map she had drawn herself over the winter, and a leather ledger with the first page already written in. The first page read, in a hand steadier than she had felt when she wrote it, April 4th, 1889, Callum Valley, 160 acres, deeded and paid. She said the words out loud once as the wagon rolled. Not because there was anyone to hear them, but because saying a thing sometimes made it heavier and therefore harder to lose. The mule's ears twitched. The sky was the color of oatmeal water. Silver Fork disappeared behind her within an hour. The road narrowed and then narrowed again and then became less a road than a memory of one. 2 shallow ruts running side by side through short grass, and by mid-morning she saw for the first time the shape of the valley she had bought. It sat between two low ridges, pale limestone on the north side, red iron-shot sandstone on the south, and the floor of it was wide and flat and bare, the kind of ground that made a person understand, immediately, why the surveyor had reached for the word barren and not looked twice for a better one. There were no trees. There was a single cottonwood at the northwest corner, dead these 6 years by the look of it, its trunk gray as ash and its bark peeling in long soft strips. There was no visible creek. There was, along the base of the north ridge, a shallow dry wash where water had once run and where a person could see, in the way the pebbles were sorted, that water had not run there in a long time. The rest was short grass, sage and stone. Iris climbed down from the wagon. She walked the north fence line first because that was what her father had always done, walking a piece of ground the way a person walked into a strange room, checking corners and edges before centers. She counted her strides. She noted, in her leather ledger, for fence posts leaning east, 1 broken cedar corner post, and a length of about 40 feet where the wire had been cut clean by someone who had not bothered to take the pieces with them. She walked the east fence, then the south, then the west. She wrote it all down. She noted the dry wash. She noted, on the south side, a broad limestone shelf that jutted out over the wash at about the height of her shoulder. A lip of pale stone perhaps 40 feet across and set back into the slope, like the underside of a mouth that had been closed a long time. She stood under it for a moment and put her hand on the cool underside of the stone. Not fear, exactly, but its close cousin, the sense of standing under something older than her family, and being counted by it. She walked back to the wagon. The mule was chewing at a tuft of sage and did not look up. By evening she had a fire, a canvas shelter stretched between the wagon and the dead cottonwood, and a cup of coffee that she had boiled with water she had brought in a barrel from town. She sat with her back against the wagon wheel and watched the sky do what a frontier sky did in April, which was change color 4 times in half an hour, from oatmeal to peach to slate to the deep and specific dark blue that meant the wind would drop before midnight. She wrote in the ledger, Day 1. Fence work needed. No water yet. Ground good for a garden by the wash. Then she wrote, in smaller letters, so small that only she could read them by the fire. Mother said the valleys people quit on are the ones that hid their water. Look under the ledges. Look where the ground is warmer than the air. Her mother, Iris Callum, had been dead 4 years. Her father had followed 2 years after that, on a march ridge, in a way the county coroner had described with the word misadventure and Iris privately understood as sorrow with a rope in its hand. Between them, they had left her a small red-covered notebook, half in her mother's handwriting and half in her father's, in which they had written down everything they knew about land and weather and water and grief. Iris carried it with her now, tied shut with a piece of blue ribbon. She did not open it every day. She opened it when she needed to hear a voice that was not her own. She opened it that first night. She read 3 paragraphs about how to sight a spring by the color of the moss on a rock face at first light. She closed it and put it back in the pine chest and did not sleep as much as she pretended. Day 2. Day 3. Day 4. The weather turned mean by the end of the first week. A cold north wind that came down off the pale ridge at dawn and did not lift again until the sun was well up. She repaired the 4 leaning fence posts by herself, digging each one deeper and packing the stones back around it in a spiral the way her father had shown her when she was 9. She patched the cut wire on the north fence with a splice she was not proud of, and made a note in the ledger to redo it before autumn. She staked out a place for a garden along the wash where the soil looked darker, and she staked out a place for a shelter of her own against the north side of the wagon, where the sun would reach it in winter. The wool merchant Deacon Ross came out on day 6, riding a bay horse and wearing a coat that looked warmer than her whole shelter. He sat in his saddle at the edge of what was now, technically, her fence, and he looked at her the way a man looks at a candle he has already decided is not going to last the night. He offered her $30 for the whole deed. He said, and his voice was almost kindly, that a woman alone did not want to be caught out here when the summer sun made the ground crack. He said Haldenpool had told him she was serious, but that serious was not the same as sensible. Iris met his eyes and did not blink. She thanked him for the offer. She said the valley was not for sale. She said it 3 separate times in 3 different phrasings, because she had learned young that a man like Deacon Ross required a woman to say a thing more than once before he would agree to have heard it. Ross touched his hat. He said he would come back in a month with a better price. He turned the bay horse and rode away, and Iris stood at the fence line and watched him go and, when he was small enough on the horizon to be forgiven, she said to no one in particular that the men in Silver Fork did not seem to understand that she had not come out here to be rescued. The mule did not seem to understand either. He was chewing on a piece of sage and looking at her with the flat and impersonal patience of an animal. Well, she said out loud to him, because there was nobody else within 4 miles to say it to, you and I are going to disappoint several people this year. The mule blinked. Iris smiled. A small, private smile, the kind she had inherited from her mother, and went back to work. Day 8. She began the shelter properly. She dug the foundation for a 2-room lean-to along the north side of the wagon, for courses of river stone laid dry, and she cut short cedar poles from a stand a mile north of the fence line, a stand the surveyor's map had also, incidentally, failed to mark, and she hauled the poles back one at a time on Rowan's back at the pace of an animal who had opinions about the arrangement. She raised the frame in 3 days. She stretched the canvas over it in 1. She banked the north wall with earth, packed it with stones, and let the sun and the wind cure the hole for a week before she moved inside. She wrote in the ledger on day 15, shelter roofed. 2 rooms. Cold at night, dry in rain. Good. Day 21. She rode into Silver Fork for a second time. She bought a pound of coffee, 4 pounds of flour, 2 pounds of dried apples, a jar of lard, a small paper packet of salt, and a length of blue ribbon. She did not need the blue ribbon. She bought it because her mother had, in life, always bought a length of blue ribbon on the first visit of any spring to any store, and because Iris had decided on the ride in that she was going to permit herself 1 small unnecessary purchase on each town trip for the length of that first summer. Merritt Vane, behind the counter, watched Iris pay in coins and did not comment on the blue ribbon. She did comment on the coffee. Callum blend, Merritt said, without looking up from the scales. That's what my husband called this one. Strong enough to walk on. He'd be pleased somebody was still buying it. Iris took the paper twist of coffee. She said, "Thank you, Mrs. Vane." Merritt. That was the whole of the exchange. It was more of an exchange than Iris had had with any other person in Silver Fork since the day she signed the deed. Day 24. She rode home. She wrote in the ledger the same evening. Merritt Vane. Possible. Watching. Day 30. Deacon Ross came out for the second time, as promised, riding the bay horse and wearing the same coat. He sat at the fence line at the same distance he had sat at the first time and made the same face he had made the first time, and he raised his offer, and Iris refused him again in 3 phrasings, and he touched his hat and rode away again, and Iris wrote in the ledger the same evening, in her steadiest hand, Ross's second visit. Offer raised to $45. Refused. He will come back once more, at least. Day 34. She built her first table. She built it out of the pine boards of the borrowed wagon, which she had, by that day, formally purchased from the man who owned it, at a price he had named as if he expected her to refuse, and which she had paid without argument, and out of 4 short cedar poles she had cut for the shelter and had reserved, all along, for a table. She set the table at the west wall of the shelter, under a small square opening she had cut in the canvas as a window. She oiled the top with a rag and a jar of lard. She set the leather ledger, closed, in the center of the table. She set the pewter cup that had held her father's cold coffee at the corner. She sat down at the table for the first time that same evening. She opened the ledger. She wrote at the top of a fresh page, in her steadiest hand, "The valley is a home now. It has a door. It has a table. It has a book on the table. From this table forward, everything else is only work." She closed the ledger. She banked the fire. She slept, for the first time since the day she signed the deed, without her boots on. Day 42. By early May she had walked every acre of the valley twice, and she had drawn her own map in the leather ledger, and the map showed things the surveyor's map did not. It showed the 7 places along the base of the pale north ridge where the sage grew taller and darker than everywhere else. It showed the small dish depression in the middle of the valley floor where, on the coldest mornings, the frost lifted a full hour later than on the ground around it. It showed the 3 fissures in the underside of the limestone shelf on the south wall where, if a person stood very still just after sunrise, They could feel a thread of colder air moving out of the rock. She had begun to suspect the valley by then. She had not begun to hope for it. Hope, she had learned young, was the beginning of poor thinking. She had also, on day 27, walked out to the north pasture at first light and stood for almost an hour looking at a single rock. It was a piece of pale limestone the size of a supper plate, tilted at an angle into the wash, and on the underside of it, where a person could not see the rock unless they knelt down and looked with intent, there was a small dark patch of moss, the color her mother had described in the red notebook as spring green. Moss like that, Iris Callum had written in her flowing careful hand, does not grow on a stone unless the stone is being kept damp by something. And something is not always rain. Iris had knelt in the wash that morning and put her palm flat against the underside of the rock. It was cold, colder than the air, colder than any rock should have been in a place a person called BARREN. She had said nothing to anyone. She had drawn a small careful circle on her map. She had written in the ledger, Possibility 1. By day 42 she had 4 possibilities marked on her map. All 4 sat along the base of the pale north ridge or under the limestone shelf on the south wall. 3 of them she was watching. The 4th, the mossstone one, she was ready that morning to test. She rose an hour before sunrise. She built no fire. She ate a piece of bread and drank a cup of cold water from her barrel, and put her father's whetstone in her apron pocket for a weight and her copper measuring cup in the other pocket for a purpose. She walked, in the gray light, out to the 4th possibility, and she stood over it for a long moment, and then she did what her mother's notebook had said to do, which was to dig. She dug for 2 hours. She dug straight down through short grass and packed sandy soil, and then a layer of small round river-worn stones that had no business being where they were unless water had, at some point, sorted them there. She dug until her palms bled through her gloves and until the sun was high enough to warm her shoulders. And at 10 in the morning the tip of her shovel bit into wet ground. Not damp. Wet. She stopped. She knelt. She scraped the loose dirt away with her hands, and she took the copper measuring cup out of her apron pocket, and she pressed the lip of it into the dark wet soil at the bottom of the hole. She held it there. It filled, slowly, patiently, the way an animal drinks when it knows there is no one watching, with cold clean water. She sat back on her heels in the hole she had dug, and she looked at the cup in her hand, and she did not smile. She did not cry. She held the cup in both palms, and she looked at the surface of the water, and it was so clear she could see her own eye reflected in it. And she thought, precisely, without adornment, my mother was right. Then she said out loud, because there was no one else in the valley to say it to, and because saying a thing sometimes made it heavier and therefore harder to lose, there is water here. She drank the cup slowly. It was cold enough that it hurt her back teeth. It was sweet the way only unforced water is sweet. No metal in it, no clay, no long journey. Old water come up short and easy from somewhere close. She stood. She refilled the hole with loose dirt, and she moved the marker stone she had set at the edge of the wash a full pace to the left so that anyone riding by would not, by accident, ride over the place. She walked back to the wagon. She wrote in the ledger, in her own steady hand, Day 42. Water on Possibility 1. Cold, clean, no taste. Enough for a garden today. Enough for more if the ledge behind it is what it looks like. She did not open her mother's notebook that night. She sat by her small fire with the ledger in her lap, and she looked up at the pale north ridge in the moonlight, and she said, to no one in particular, I owe you the rest of my life. Then, because thanks felt insufficient, she added, and I will not tell anyone until I know exactly what I have. The mule was asleep standing up, one ear cocked to the wind. The wind was moving south down the valley, not fast, not urgent. A wind that had come off the pale ridge cool and dry and had picked up, along the way, the faint distinct scent of wet stone. Day 44. She walked the wash from end to end at first light, following the direction the water in her cup had come from. She walked with her back bent and her eyes on the ground, and she stopped every 20 paces to kneel and press her palm to the earth, the way her mother's notebook had said to do when tracing a source. In 3 places she felt cold under her palm where she should have felt sun-warmed sand. In 2 of those 3, she found, on scraping back the topsoil, the same dark dampness she had found at Possibility 1. In the 3rd, she found nothing yet, But she marked the spot on her map with a small careful cross, and she wrote in the ledger, in the smallest letters she could still read, Possibility 5. Day 47. She rode into Silver Fork again, the third time, and bought a small brass thermometer from Merritt Vane's back cabinet. She did not tell Merritt what she wanted it for. She rode home and, in the shelter at dusk, held the thermometer's bulb into the water at Possibility 1 and read it by lantern. The water read 52 degrees. She wrote it down. She had, in her father's notebook, a marginal note in his handwriting that said, "Any spring under 55 in July is fed from more than surface." That was July 20 days off yet, and the reading in the morning of day 47 was already 52. She closed the ledger and looked at the pale ridge in the moonlight and said nothing at all. There was a kind of silence that answered a person better than any word. Day 51. The morning of her ride into Silver Fork, the one on which she asked Merritt Vane the 3 quiet questions. Iris rode out of the valley at first light with the mule Rowan in the borrowed cart and her ledger on the seat beside her under a folded canvas. She stopped at the top of the low bluff on the west side of the valley for a moment and turned in the seat and looked back down at the wide bare bowl of the ground she had bought. From that height, in the early sun, a person could see 3 things about the valley that a person on the valley floor could not. The first was the exact shape of the dish depression in the middle. The second was the pale line, faint as a smudge, where the underground water flow ran east under the shelf and turned south. The third was the way the 4 possibilities on her map, marked in her ledger with small careful crosses, lay along a curved line that traced, precisely and without accident, the underside of the pale ridge from northwest to southeast. She stood in the cart for a long moment, holding the reins loose, and she did not say anything at all. There were times a person did not need to. She turned the cart and rode on into Silver Fork, and she was quieter than usual in Merritt Vane's store that morning, and Merritt Vane noticed the quiet and did not remark on it. That was later, the morning Merritt Vane added Iris Callum's name to a small list of her own, a list she kept in the back of an account book under the counter, in her own private hand, of the customers of Silver Fork whose word she considered reliable. There were, at the time, 4 other names on that list. Iris's was the 5th. Day 58. By mid-May the garden along the wash had 4 rows planted beans, carrots, turnips, and a short row of the strong-stemmed rye seed her mother had once described as the only crop worth trusting to a valley you did not yet fully know. Iris watered the rows by hand for the first 10 days, walking the copper measuring cup back and forth from the dug well at Possibility 1, and by day 58 she had dug the well proper. A lined pit 6 feet deep, walled with river stones she had hauled up from the wash, floored with clean sand, and the water was rising in it to within 18 inches of the top and holding there, cold and steady, no matter how much she drew off. She had told no one. She had, however, ridden into Silver Fork once, on day 51 in a borrowed cart, wearing her plainest dress and a face that gave nothing away, and she had, in the general store, asked the storekeeper Merritt Vane 3 quiet, careful questions. She had asked what the price of 100 foot of iron pipe was in Silver Fork in May. She had asked what a hand-cranked well pump cost and where the nearest one was. And she had asked whether Merritt knew of any traveling ditch digger who might come out to a homestead in the summer to dig a channel a woman had marked and would pay for herself. Merritt Vane was a widow in her 50s with hands like a farrier's and eyes that had seen a great many people try to be casual in her store. She looked at Iris across the counter for a full, slow moment. Then she wrote down 3 names on a slip of paper, folded it once, and slid it across without comment. The first name was a ditch digger out of 2 Forks named Ephraim Kell. The second was a blacksmith in Silver Fork who could weld pipe on order. The third was Merritt Vane's own, followed by 2 words, "Ask me." Iris put the slip inside her ledger. She thanked Merritt. She bought a pound of coffee and a length of oilcloth she did not particularly need, because she did not want the visit to look like what it was, and she rode back out to the valley the same afternoon. Day 63. Halden Poole rode out for the first time since she had signed the deed. He came up the wash trail alone. On a rangy chestnut he sat too heavily, and he stopped his horse at the fence a full 10 yards before he needed to, the way a man stops when he wants a woman to walk out to him. Iris did not walk out. She waited, at the corner of her small shelter, hands loose at her sides, until he swung down himself and came to her fence. He was younger than Deacon Ross by a decade and larger by a hand. He had the kind of face, square, sunburned, with pale eyes set a shade too close, that suggested a man who had never had to explain himself to anyone in his own family. He looked first at her garden, then at her wagon, then at the fresh-turned earth around the well. "You've been digging," he said. "I have," she said. "For what?" "For a garden," she said. "As I said in the land office." He looked at the well. The well was not visible from where he stood. She had, deliberately, banked earth and stone around it, but the fresh soil around it was. He was not stupid. He would have counted, in a glance, that the fresh soil was more than a garden required. "You struck water," he said. "Not a question." "I dug a shallow catchment for the garden," she said evenly. "The wash runs a little in April." "The wash," said Haldenpool, "does not run in April. Not this year. Not last year. Not the year before." "Then perhaps I have been lucky," said Iris. He looked at her for a long time. She looked back. Not fear this time, and not its cousin either, something further along the same road, a thing that had the same shape as fear and none of its softness. She recognized it and she named it privately. Attention. She was paying attention. She had decided, standing at the fence, that Haldenpool was not the same species of danger as Deacon Ross. Ross wanted to be rid of her because she was inconvenient. Poole, she suspected already, wanted something specific. He tipped his hat. "I'll be back," he said. "There's an offer coming that will make Deacon Ross's look small." "There is no offer that will make me sell," said Iris. He mounted the chestnut. He rode down the wash at a walk, and at the bend he turned in the saddle and looked back at her. Once, and Iris met his eye and did not look away. That night she moved the well cover. She built a low wooden housing over the mouth of the well, a plain thing that looked from any distance like a woodshed. She banked more earth around the base. She scattered dry sage over the freshly turned soil so that from the wash trail, in another 2 weeks of wind, it would look like nothing at all. The mule watched her work. When she was done, she stood at the edge of the well housing and put her palm flat on the cool boards, and she said, in the voice she used when she was speaking to the valley itself, "Not yet. Not to them." Day 74. Ephraim Kell came out from Two Forks on a Tuesday, in his own wagon with 3 shovels, a length of oiled canvas, and a face that gave away nothing whatsoever. He was in his 60s, wiry, brown, with a white mustache and eyes the color of creek water. He was, Merritt Vane had noted in a second folded slip, deaf in the left ear on purpose, meaning he had trained himself over 40 years of digging on other people's land, to hear only the things a person hired him to hear. Iris walked him along the wash. She showed him the 4 possibilities on her map. She did not show him, that first day, the well she had already dug. She let him look at the shelf on the south wall and the moss stones along the north base and the shape of the dish depression in the valley floor. Ephraim Kell walked in silence for 2 hours. He stopped twice and knelt and put his palm on the ground the way a doctor puts a palm on a chest. He did not, in either place, say anything. At the end of the second hour, he sat down on a flat rock at the base of the south ledge and he rolled a cigarette he did not light. He looked at Iris. "Miss Callum," he said, "you've got yourself a valley with a spring in it. Not a seep, a spring. And not one. There's likely 3 running under this shelf right here, coming from somewhere up under the Pale Ridge across the way. This whole floor is a saucer, and the saucer's been filling. You dig a channel from that ledge over there down through the wash and out to your fence line at the south. You'll have year-round water for 100 acres. Maybe more. Maybe 2. Iris was silent. She let the silence hold. Then she said quietly, "How long?" "To dig it right," said Ephraim Kell, 6 weeks. "To dig it wrong, too." "I don't do it wrong." "How much?" He named a figure. It was more than she had in the world and less than she had feared. "When can you start?" "Monday." She looked at him for a moment. Then she extended her hand across the flat rock. He took it. His grip was dry as paper and steady as a stone. Day 67. Merritt Vane sent a note out with a passing wagon. The note was 1 line, in her own hand. "If you have not yet met Amos Dell, ride in on Saturday. He will be at the office at 10. Iris rode in on Saturday. Amos Dell was at his desk, reading the same stock circular he was reading 18 years later at his death. He rose when she came in. He did not offer her a chair immediately. He looked at her, a plain, unhurried assessment that carried none of the calculation in Halden Poole's look and none of the flat dismissal in Deacon Ross's. And then he offered her a chair and coffee, and after she had accepted both, 10 uninterrupted minutes of his attention. She did not tell him about the well. She told him she had bought the valley on day 1, and that she was working it, and that she had reason to expect visitors of an unwelcome kind by autumn. She said she was not asking for protection. She was asking only whether he would consider her, if a matter ever came formally before his office, a party whose word could be relied on. Amos Dell looked at her over the rim of his cup for a long moment. Then he said, "Miss Callum, I will consider anyone whose word can be relied on to be a party whose word can be relied on. That is not a favor. That is my office's function." He set the cup down. He added, "I will also tell you that I have, in this office, in 11 years, watched Deacon Ross attempt to buy out more homesteaders than I care to count. Some of them sold. Some did not. Of the ones who did not, a fair number came into this office at some point to describe difficulties. I have kept a small notebook on those difficulties. You are welcome, if any comes to you, to add to it." Iris thanked him. She rode home. She wrote in the ledger that night, "Amos Dell. Trusted. 5th on the list." The list was, at that point, still very short. Day 71. The blacksmith Pearly Coombs rode out to the valley on his own. Iris had not sent for him, and he arrived at mid-morning on a hot afternoon in the 2nd week of June. He dismounted at the fence line and he walked to the shelter door with his hat in his hand, and he said, in the plainest sentence he had ever, in his life, been called upon to speak, "Miss Callum." Merritt sent word by way of a look, which is how Merritt sends most of her word. "I understand you may, later this summer, have a use for a man who can weld pipe. When you have need of me, send word by way of any writer you trust. I will come." He touched his hat. He rode away. Iris wrote in the ledger that evening, "Pearly Coombs. Trusted. 6th on the list." Day 89. By early June, Ephraim Kell had begun the channel. A shallow, careful trench that ran from the base of the south ledge northeast down the wash and then broke southwest along a contour Iris herself had walked out with a piece of string and a level her father had built one winter out of a wooden trough and 2 nails. He worked with 2 hired men out of 2 forks, both of whom said very little and one of whom, a young man named Silas Marn, took his coffee in the same tin cup every day and returned it to Iris rinsed each evening without being asked. They dug at the pace of Ephraim's judgment, which was slow. He tested the sides of the trench with a knuckle every few feet. He measured the drop with a small brass level of his own. Twice in the first week, he ordered a section undone and redone with a shallower angle, and both times Iris did not argue because Ephraim Kell was, she had realized on the first Monday morning, the second person in her life she was going to trust without conditions. The first had been her mother. The false calm broke on day 96. That morning she rode into Silver Fork to buy pipe. She had ordered 40 feet of 1-inch iron pipe from the blacksmith 3 weeks before, and she had, on Merritt Vane's advice, ordered it under her mother's maiden name, Elsbeth Renfrew, so that the town, watching, would see only that a Miss Renfrew from out east was setting up something the town did not need to know about yet. At the blacksmith's, she paid for the pipe. She walked out with the receipt folded into her ledger. She stopped by Merritt Vane's to pick up a sack of nails. Merritt was behind the counter. Her face, when Iris stepped inside, had a quality Iris had learned to read in her mother's face and had come to trust in Merritt's. Not warning, exactly, but the beginning of a warning. Merritt looked at Iris over the counter and she said, quietly and clearly, "Deacon Ross was in yesterday. He asked Wilbur at the assay office 3 questions about your valley, in a voice that carried. Halden Poole was in this morning. He asked me too. What did you tell them?" "Nothing," said Merritt. "That's what worries me. Neither of them expected nothing. Neither of them was pleased with it." Iris paid for her nails. She thanked Merritt. On the ride back, in the borrowed cart, she reread the 4 names in her ledger of people she trusted in Silver Fork, and she added a 5th, Ephraim Kell. She did not add Merritt Vane. Merritt Vane had been on the first list since day 51. She reached the valley just past sundown. Ephraim Kell met her at the wagon. His face, in the last light, was set the way it had been set the morning he named the price of the channel, plain, without ornament, the face of a man about to say something he did not want to have to say. Somebody was up on the Pale Ridge today, he said. 2 riders sat their horses at the ridge line for the better part of an hour. Watched us dig. Left before the light went. Recognized them. One of them was a big man on a chestnut. The other was smaller. Deacon Ross, if I had to guess for the smaller one, but I wouldn't swear it in a court. Iris looked up at the pale ridge in the fading light. The ridge line looked the way it always looked. Bone-colored, unmoved, indifferent. She wrote in the ledger that night, Day 96. Riders on the ridge. Ross and Poole likely both. They have not offered again since day 63. They are past offering. She closed the ledger. She sat by her small fire. She did not open her mother's notebook. She spoke, instead, in her mind to her mother the way she had been speaking to her since she was 14, in a voice she did not have to say out loud for the woman to hear. Mother, she thought, they know. They don't know what they know yet, but they know. The wind moved down the valley. The wind carried, again, the faint distinct scent of wet stone. Day 108. The channel reached the wash. Ephraim Kell tested the drop with his brass level. He looked satisfied for the first time in 6 weeks, which on his face registered as the mustache lifting perhaps 1/4 of an inch on the right side. Silas Marne shoveled the last 3 feet in silence. When the shovel bit through the last plug of clay, water came into the channel, cold, clear, unhurried, the same water Iris had first drunk out of a copper cup, and it moved down the trench at the pace of a slow-walking horse. Iris stood at the fence line and watched it come. It reached the first stake at the head of the garden row within the hour. It reached the second within 2. She did not smile. She did not cry. She wrote in the ledger, in her steadiest hand, Day 108. Water in the channel. Down to the garden. Rye rose first. Beans second. Carrots third. Then, in smaller letters only for herself, my mother was right. My father was right. What the valley had hidden it had hidden on purpose, and now it was hers. She closed the book. Ephraim Kell rolled a cigarette he did not light. Silas Marne accepted a cup of coffee. The 3 of them stood at the head of the channel for a long moment and watched the water do the thing water does when it has been asked politely to come somewhere useful, which is to come without ceremony and to stay. Day 114. Halden Poole rode into the valley in the middle of the afternoon. He did not stop at the fence this time. He rode straight down the wash and reined up at the edge of the channel where the water was running at its slow, steady walking pace, and he sat on the chestnut and looked at it for a long moment without speaking. Iris walked out to meet him. He did not dismount. He said, without preamble, you did not tell anyone. There was nothing to tell, said Iris. There was, said Halden Poole. There is. There is water here that runs year-round, and there are 3 ranches within 20 miles that will pay any price to have first call on it in a dry summer, and there is at least 1 ranch owner who has already begun to make inquiries at the county about whether the deed on this valley was properly recorded. The deed is recorded. The deed is recorded, said Halden Poole, but there is more than one way to test a deed's recording. Then test it, said Iris. She said it quietly. She said it without heat. She said it with the small private smile she had inherited from her mother, and she said it while looking Halden Poole in his pale, close-set eyes without any softness at all, and Halden Poole did not, that afternoon, offer her a price. He turned the chestnut and rode back up the wash at a walk. At the bend, he did not turn to look back. Iris stood at the edge of the channel and let the water run past her boots for perhaps a full minute. Then she went inside to write in the ledger. She wrote, Day 114. Poole knows. He will move next. Prepare. Day 101. The rye seedlings broke ground. Iris was on her knees at the head of the first row when it happened, pale green shoots pushing up through the dark wet soil in a pattern almost too even to be an accident. She counted the shoots per foot with the end of a pencil the way her mother had taught her, and she wrote the number in the ledger without looking away from the row. 41 per foot in the first stretch, 38 in the second, 40 in the third. Even germination, the kind a person only gets when the water underneath is steady and the soil above has been given enough of it without drowning. She did not, that morning, allow herself the feeling that pressed up against the back of her ribs. She named it privately and then set it aside, the way a person sets aside a coat they do not yet have a place to hang. She rose from her knees and she walked the length of the 4 rows and she counted every one of them. Day 104. Silas Marne, riding home from town on his own bay one late afternoon, stopped at the fence and stood his horse there without dismounting. He looked at the rye rows. He did not ask any question. He said only, "Miss Callum, that is a good stand. That is a very good stand." Iris walked out to the fence. She said, "It is Mr. Marne." "Thank you." He touched his hat. He wrote on. She wrote in the ledger that night. Silas Marne saw the rye, understood, said nothing more than was needed. That is a man in the shape of his father, wherever his father was. She did not know at the time that Silas Marne's father had been Ephraim Kell's second cousin and had died in a mine collapse when Silas was 9, and that Silas had been raised, from that year, by an aunt in Two Forks who had said little and worked hard. She would learn all of this later in the 4th year at a wedding. Day 111. A wagon of children from Silver Fork came out with the schoolteacher Ada Barlow, 6 children between 10 and 13, a picnic basket, and Ada herself driving a rented cart. They came, Ada said, because a schoolteacher of Silver Fork was permitted, once each spring, to take her older pupils on an educational ride to see a piece of country a person had claimed and was working. This year, said Ada, she had considered the choice and settled on the Callum place, if that was agreeable to Miss Callum. It was agreeable. Iris took the children along the fence, along the wash, along the 4 rye rows. She did not show them the well. She showed them, at the base of the south ledge, the fissure where a person could feel the cold air moving. She let each child kneel and put a palm against the underside of the shelf. Every child was silent for a moment after. That, Iris wrote later in the ledger, was more of an assessment of the valley than any surveyor had ever given it. Day 106. Rowan died in his sleep at the corner of the shelter. Iris buried him at the west edge of the valley under the dead cottonwood, and she did not, in the ledger, write any more than the single line, "Rowan gone. Good animal. Good work." Day 137. By mid-July the garden was producing more than Iris could eat, more than the mule and the 2 chickens she had bought from Merritt Vane could eat, more than the neighbors, if she had neighbors, could reasonably have refused. She began to give it away in careful measured baskets, wrapped in the oilcloth she had bought in May. She rode into Silver Fork on the 1st Saturday of every fortnight. She brought Merritt Vane a basket of carrots, a bunch of beans, a small paper cone of dried thyme. She brought Sheriff Amos Dell, a tall, calm widower in his 40s, whose name Merritt had added to the list on day 108, in the same careful handwriting, a small paper cone of coffee she had ground herself. She brought the blacksmith, Pearlie Coombs, a jar of pickled beans. She brought the schoolteacher, Miss Ada Barlow, a small bunch of dried thyme and a note thanking her for a book Ada had lent her without ever having met her. She did not, at any point, describe her valley in a full sentence to anyone. She did not, at any point, deny anything about it either. She simply gave people things, and she wrote down in her ledger, at the end of every fortnight, which people had accepted the things gladly, which had accepted them warily, and which had, in a way she could not quite name, accepted them like an early payment on a debt they had not yet decided whether they wished to be owed. By the end of July she had 6 names on the trusted list. By the end of August 8. By the middle of September 10 Merritt Vane, Sheriff Amos Dell, the blacksmith Pearlie Coombs, the schoolteacher Ada Barlow, the doctor's widow Laureen Hoff, the assistant preacher Frederick Nye, the postmistress Cornelia Vance, the farrier's daughter Grace Marne, Silas's sister, who had come out once at Silas's request to help her lay a stone step at the shelter door, Ephraim Kell, and an unlikely addition made on the evening of day 141, the wool merchant's own younger sister, Winnie Ross, who had walked into Merritt's store one afternoon and said in a voice pitched deliberately for Iris to hear, "Some of what my brother does I have never approved of, and Miss Callum should know that." Iris had inclined her head to Winnie Ross. Winnie Ross had inclined her head back. Neither of them had said anything more that afternoon, and neither of them had needed to. Day 149. The rye began to head. Iris had never grown rye at scale before. She had grown a single test row 2 summers earlier, on a rented plot outside the town where she had lived after her father's death, and she stood at the fence line on the morning of day 149 with her ledger open in one hand and her copper measuring cup in the other, and she counted the number of stems per square foot in the first row for a full slow half-hour, and she wrote the number down, and then she went and did it in the second row, and then the third. The rye kept growing. That was what she wrote at the bottom of the ledger page, in a small unadorned line. The rye kept growing. She did not know, when she wrote it, that she was practicing the sentence that would end her ledger and, eventually, her life. She only knew, in that moment, that the rye had come in stronger than her mother's notebook had said it would in a first year, and that the channel water had made a difference the surveyor's map had not accounted for. She stood at the fence for a while longer. Not happiness exactly. Happiness, she had learned young, was a different animal, and this was a smaller and more particular one. The thing she was feeling did not have a name in her mother's language, and she chose not to give it one in her own. She wrote in the ledger simply, Rye rows 1 through 4 heading. First season. Called it good. Day 156. Ephraim Kell finished the last 100 feet of the channel and rowed back to Two Forks with his 2 shovels, his brass level, and Silas Marne. He did not, in leaving, embrace her because Ephraim Kell was not a man who embraced anyone. He did, however, at the fence, take his hat off. A thing Iris had not seen him do in 4.5 months of working her ground, and he said in his short, careful way, Miss Callum, this water will outlast me. I don't say that lightly. I know you don't, said Iris. He put the hat back on. He rode away up the wash. Silas Marne, at the bend, turned in the saddle once and lifted his own hat, and Iris raised her palm in return, and that was the whole of the parting. She stood at the fence for a long moment after they were gone. Then she said out loud to the mule, who was, by this point in the year, an animal she had begun to think of as a companion in the specific frontier way that companion meant an animal one did not need to lie to, we are going to have visitors before the frost. The mule did not disagree. Day 163. The first visitor arrived. He was a rancher named Judson Croft, out of the eastern range, 40 miles from the valley. He was in his 60s, gray-bearded, mounted on a good horse, and he had not been invited. He rode up the wash at a walk, and he stopped at Iris's fence, and he sat his horse politely for a long moment before he asked leave to come inside. Iris, standing at the shelter door, thought about it, then nodded. He dismounted. He met her at the mouth of the channel, and he looked at the water in it for a full, slow minute. Then he looked at her and he said, in a voice that had none of Deacon Ross's calculation and none of Halden Poole's pressure, Miss Callum, my cattle drank at a creek that dried up in May. I have not brought them past the ridge, because I am not here to threaten your ground. I am here to ask you, plainly, whether at some fair price you would be willing to consider letting my herd water at your fence line for the last 6 weeks of the summer. Iris looked at Judson Croft. She looked at his horse, which was thin but not neglected. The coat was brushed and the tack was in good repair, and the animal was thin because the summer had been long, not because the man had been careless. She said, sit down, Mr. Croft. I will bring you a cup of coffee, and then we will speak about what a fair price for water is between neighbors who did not know each other before this year. He sat down. She brought him a cup of coffee. They spoke, at her small pine table, for an hour and 40 minutes, and at the end of that time Iris walked with him to the fence and pointed out where his herd could water, and how far up the wash they could come, and what she would take in return, which was not money, but a written note in his hand promising 3 good ewes come lambing season and a share of his fall wool clip. Judson Croft signed the note in her ledger. He shook her hand. He rode away in the sunlate light. Iris watched him go until the horse and rider were the size of a thumb on the horizon, and then she went back inside her shelter and she wrote in the ledger. Day 163. First formal water agreement. Judson Croft, Eastern Range. Sheep for wool clip. He is not the danger. He is the beginning of the answer to the danger. She closed the ledger. Outside the wind moved south down the valley, cool and dry, carrying, as it always did now, the faint distinct scent of wet stone. Day 158. Iris signed her first written contract for delivered rye. The buyer was a miller in Two Forks named Boaz Trent, whom Ephraim Kell had introduced by letter. Trent had ridden the 40 miles out to the valley in a wagon of his own, with his son beside him, and had stood at the head of the first rye row for a full 10 minutes running the pale grain heads through his palm before saying anything. When he did speak, he named a price per bushel that was 15% above the standing county rate for the season, and Iris, who had, in preparation, quietly obtained the standing county rate from Merritt Vane 2 weeks earlier, did not immediately accept. "Mr. Trent," she said, "that is a fair price for a stand you have not yet seen harvested." "I have not seen it harvested either. I will accept the 15% premium if the terms include a clause that I deliver at the county rate, without the premium. In any year the harvest does not reach a stand per acre I will specify in the contract. That way you are paying for a proven crop, not a hopeful one." Boaz Trent looked at Iris for a long moment. Then he looked at his son. Then he looked back at Iris. He said, "Miss Callum, that is a fairer clause than any miller has ever been offered on this side of the county line. I accept." They wrote the contract at Iris's small pine table.
Boaz Trent sont witnessed.
Silas Marne, who was in the shelter yard fixing a hinge, was called in to witness for Iris's side. The contract was signed at 4:30 in the afternoon on day 158, and Iris entered it in the ledger the same evening as the first written commercial agreement of the valley. Day 172. The letter came from Whitfield Ames, his own letter unsolicited, enclosing, at Amos Dell's earlier request, a preliminary willingness to walk the parcel if formally engaged. Iris folded the letter and put it in the ledger. She did not, at that time, formally engage him. She was, on day 172, still hoping the challenge from Ross would not require a formal walk. She was not hoping foolishly. She was hoping in the plain frontier way, which was as a person watches a rising line of weather on the horizon and hopes, without any particular expectation of being answered, that it will pass north of them. Day 165. Judson Croft's second visit. He rode out to the fence with a paper packet of seed rye he had, at his own trouble, obtained from a farmer he trusted at the head of the eastern range, and he left the packet at the shelter door with a folded note pinned to it. The note said, in his own hand, "For next spring." It was not a payment. It was not a gift. It was the plain, unadorned exchange of one competent person with another. Day 179. By the first week of August, for more ranchers had come, one by one on their own horses in their own time, and each had asked, plainly, whether they might water at Iris's fence for the tail of the summer. She had said yes to 3 of them at fair prices in kind, a bushel of oats, a wool clip share, a promise of winter hay hauled to her door in November. She had said no to the 4th, a young man named Jacob Ellery who worked for Deacon Ross, because she had recognized his coat. Jacob Ellery had ridden away without arguing. He had, however, on his way out of the valley, ridden slowly along the north fence line for the length of it, and Iris, watching from the shelter door, had understood that he was counting. Counting what, she was not immediately sure, the fence posts perhaps, or the visible outbuildings, or the exact placement of the channel head under the south ledge. She wrote in the ledger that night, Day 179, Ellery scouting for Ross. They will not offer again. They will move. Day 183. Deacon Ross moved. He did not come himself. Ross was cleverer than that. What came on the afternoon of day 183 was a letter, folded twice, sealed with a wafer, delivered by a boy on a rented pony out of Silver Fork, and addressed in a hand Iris did not recognize to Miss Iris Callum, Callum Valley. The letter was 3 paragraphs long. It stated, in careful legal English, that a party, unnamed in the letter, but transparent in intent, had filed a challenge with the county land office, claiming that the survey on which Iris's deed rested was insufficient, that the boundaries of the parcel had never been formally rewalked with a licensed surveyor in the 11 years since the original filing, and that as a matter of standing water rights the parcel could not be considered to include any subterranean source whose actual origin lay outside the described contour of the surface parcel. In plain speech, the letter said, "Your water may not be legally yours." Iris read the letter twice. She folded it back along its 2 creases. She put it inside her ledger. She sat at her small pine table for a long moment with her hands flat on the wood, and the thing she felt was not fear and not its cousin, but a third thing farther along, a cold, clear stillness that felt, when she named it in her mind, like a decision that had been waiting for her all summer. She rode into Silver Fork the next morning. She did not go to Merritt Vane's first. She went to the sheriff's office. Amos Dell was at his desk. He was reading a stock circular. He did not look up until she had shut the door behind her, and then he looked up and he saw her face and he stood. Miss Callum. Sheriff, I would like to know whether Deacon Ross has filed anything in your office this week. Amos Dell was silent for a moment. Then he said carefully, not in mine. In the county's, yes. He filed a challenge on the surface survey of your parcel. It arrived by the Wednesday mail. I have not been asked to act on it, but I have been asked to make it known that it exists. Made known to whom? To me. To the postmistress. To Pearlie Coombs at the smithy. To Merritt Vane. It is being made known to the people Ross expects to feel it move. Iris nodded, slowly. Is the challenge sound? That, said Amos Dell, is the question. She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, Sheriff, I would like to hire a surveyor. Not Halden Poole. Not anyone under contract to Deacon Ross. A licensed man from outside the county, who has no stake in the ridge or the water. I will pay his fee out of my own pocket, and I would like his walk of my ground to be witnessed by you and by 2 people of Silver Fork whose names I will submit for your approval. Amos Dell looked at her. He was, she noticed, a man who did not blink when he was thinking. Then he said, Miss Callum, I will write to a man I know in 2 Forks. His name is Whitfield Ames. He is a licensed surveyor and he is, to my knowledge, the only one within a week's ride who has never in his working life accepted a private commission from a rancher. He will come if I write. Then please write. He wrote. She rode back to the valley with the copy of the letter folded into her ledger, and she did not sleep more than 2 hours that night. But she did not, at any point, allow herself to open her mother's notebook. Her mother's notebook was for the days she needed a voice that was not her own. This day, she thought, she needed her own. Day 191. Whitfield Ames arrived. He was a lean man in his 50s, gray-eyed, in a dust-colored coat and a hat that had seen every kind of weather. He rode a small tough gray horse and he carried, in a canvas roll, a set of chains and a brass compass and a battered leveling rod that had been repainted so many times the numbers no longer matched any 2 markings on it. He arrived at the fence line at 10 in the morning, with Sheriff Amos Dell riding beside him on his own good bay and Merritt Vane and Pearlie Coombs following in Merritt's cart. The 4 of them walked the valley for 2 full days. They walked the fence line first. Iris beside them, ledger in hand, saying almost nothing. Whitfield Ames took his own measurements. He set his rod at each corner. He sighted along the pale ridge and the red ridge with his brass compass, and he wrote in his own small notebook in a hand smaller and more cramped than Iris's own. On the afternoon of the 2nd day, standing at the base of the south ledge, he set his rod against the underside of the limestone shelf. He looked up along the fissures. He looked back at Sheriff Amos Dell and at Merritt Vane and at Pearlie Coombs, and he said, in a voice pitched for a courtroom rather than a valley, I record, as of the 11th of August, in the presence of Sheriff Amos Dell, Mrs. Merritt Vane, and Mr. Pearlie Coombs of Silver Fork, that the origin of the spring waters in this parcel lies entirely under the described surface contour of the parcel, that no portion of the source lies outside the deeded boundary as filed and recorded on the 4th of April of this year, and that the water rights arising from that source belong, in law and in fact, to the deeded owner, namely Miss Iris Callum. He wrote it out in his notebook. Sheriff Amos Dell signed under it. Merritt Vane signed under him. Pearlie Coombs signed under Merritt. Iris did not sign. She did not need to. She stood at the base of the south ledge with her ledger open in one hand and her copper measuring cup empty in the other, and she said, quietly, only for herself, one plain sentence about ledges and warm ground that her mother had written down a decade before her own death. She did not say it a second time. She had planted it in the ledger on day 108, and she had planted it in her own mouth here, on day 192, and she would not restate it again until the end. Whitfield Ames rode out the following morning with the signed page in his saddlebag and a promise to file its copy with the county surveyor by the end of the week. Day 195. The morning after Whitfield Ames rode out with the signed page, Iris walked out to the base of the south ledge alone. She carried her father's whetstone in her apron pocket, as she had every morning of the summer, and her copper measuring cup in the other pocket, empty. She stood under the shelf where Ames had set his rod the previous day, and she put her palm on the cool underside of the stone the way she had put it there on day one, and she stood there for a long moment in the pale early light. She said out loud, to the ledge and to the water underneath it and to the 4-year-dead mother who had, in her red-covered notebook, written down what her daughter had on that morning, walked out into the pale early light to confirm you held. Thank you. She turned. She walked back to the shelter. She did not open the notebook. Day 199. Merritt Vane came out with 2 other women in her cart. Ada Barlow and a woman Iris had not previously met, a spare gray-haired doctor's widow named Laureen Hoff. Laureen Hoff had, Merritt said as the 3 women dismounted, been asking after Iris in the store for 2 weeks. She wished, if it was agreeable to Miss Callum, to meet the woman she had been hearing about. Iris invited them all inside. She made coffee. Laureen Hoff sat at the small pine table and looked at the shelter and at the ledger open on the table's edge, at Iris's own careful hand, which Laureen studied for a full moment without comment. And then she said, in a voice that had, Iris realized within the first 3 words, been trained on delivering bad news gently to grieving families for 30 years, Miss Callum. My late husband, Dr. Hoff, kept a small journal about the country between the Pale Ridge and the Red one. He believed there was water under it. He walked the ridge many times before he died. He never found it because he was looking on the wrong side. I have brought his journal for you. I have no children who would want it. I would like it to sit on your shelf. She placed a small brown leather book on the table between them. Iris did not open it. She placed her own hand flat over it for a moment, then moved it aside carefully to the edge of the table where the ledger sat, and set the ledger on top of it in a small deliberate stack. Mrs. Hoff, said Iris. Thank you. I will read it in the winter, when the water is quiet, and I will treat it as I would treat my own mother's. Laureen Hoff did not answer. Laureen Hoff had been a doctor's wife for 38 years and had learned, along the way, that some thanks are best received without any answer at all. She simply inclined her head, a small deliberate motion, and drank her coffee. Day 202. The evening after Laureen Hoff left the small brown leather book on the pine table, Iris did not open it. She let it sit on the shelf where she had placed it, at the edge of her mother's red-covered notebook and her own leather ledger, and she looked at all 3 books together in the lantern light, and she understood, in that moment, that she was assembling, without having intended to, a small library of women who had watched a piece of country and written down what they had seen. Day 204. The County Land Office received Whitfield Ames's filing on the morning of the 15th of August. Deacon Ross received the news of it through Halden Poole, who received it in turn through a clerk named Bidwell whom Ross had, for the last 3 years, paid a small monthly consideration to notice things, before the sun set that same day. By the morning of day 205 there were 4 men on the Pale Ridge above the valley. Not 2, for Iris counted them from her shelter door in the first gray light, and she did not raise a hand to shade her eyes because she did not wish to give them the satisfaction of seeing her look. She wrote in the ledger, without turning her head, Day 205. For riders on the ridge. Dawn. She did not know their names that morning. She learned 3 of them by evening: Halden Poole, Jacob Ellery, a hired man out of the eastern range named Bull Meacham. The 4th she did not identify by name until later, but by his shape at the ridgeline she knew him. Deacon Ross had come out himself. The riders did not descend. They watched. They stayed on the ridge until the sun was fully up, and then they rode back the way they had come, and Iris, standing at her shelter door with her ledger in her hand and her father's whetstone in her apron pocket for a weight, understood that the watching had been the whole point. Ross was showing her that he could put 4 men above her at any hour, and that he intended her to know it, and that he expected her, on that knowledge alone, to reconsider. She did not reconsider. She rode into Silver Fork that afternoon. She went to Amos Dell first. She reported the 4 men on the ridge. Dell wrote it down in his own book. She went to Merritt Vane second. Merritt was already, that morning, on her way to Iris. She had heard from Pearlie Coombs, who had heard from a hostler who had seen the 4 horses saddled at dawn. She went to Ada Barlow third. Ada Barlow was in the schoolhouse yard, sweeping, and Iris told her plainly what had happened. And Ada Barlow leaned on the broom and looked at Iris for a long moment and then said, Miss Callum, if it comes to it, The school children's mothers will stand on your fence line with a Sunday hymnal each. I do not think it will come to it. But you should know. Iris nodded. She did not, in that moment, allow herself to soften. She rode home. Day 209. The offer arrived. Came again by a boy on a rented pony. Came again folded twice and sealed with a wafer. Iris read it standing in the shelter doorway with the light of the late afternoon full on her face. The offer, in the same careful legal English as before, proposed the following. Deacon Ross would purchase the parcel for the sum of $6,000 in cash, would drop the county challenge on the surface survey, would furnish Iris with a signed release of any future claim to the ground or its waters, and would engage her on a 5-year contract at a fair wage, as manager of the ranch operation he intended to build on the site. $6,000 was, in the county in the year 1889, an enormous sum. It was more than any homesteader Iris knew had ever seen at one time in their life. It was, in the parlance of the country, life-changing money. She folded the letter along its creases. She put it inside her ledger. She wrote a reply that same evening. The reply was 6 lines long. It thanked Mr. Ross for the courtesy of the offer. It declined the offer entirely and without counter. It said that the valley was not for sale at $6,000 nor at $60,000. It said that Miss Callum wished Mr. Ross well and requested only that the 4 riders be, in future, kept from the ridge above her fence at dawn. It ended, "Yours in good faith, Iris Callum." She sealed it. She sent it back by the same boy on the same pony. Day 213. The first pressure came. It was subtle. It was not a rider on a ridge, and it was not a letter. It was Merritt Vane, riding out to the valley at mid-morning with her cart empty and her face set, and it was the news Merritt brought. The blacksmith Pearlie Coombs had, that morning, had his single largest customer. A stagecoach company that used him to res-hoe its teams, informed by written notice that his services were no longer required. The postmistress Cornelia Vance had, the previous evening, been visited at her home by her own second cousin, a man who did occasional bookkeeping for Deacon Ross, and had been asked, in a voice pitched to sound like family concern, whether Cornelia had considered how many packages the post office in Silver Fork handled that came through Ross Wool. The doctor's widow Laureen Hoff had received, in yesterday's mail, a bill for the outstanding balance on a small standing account at Ross Wool that she had, for 8 years, been paying in monthly increments without pressure, now, without warning, called due in full within the month. Iris listened to Merritt Vane in silence. She did not interrupt. She wrote nothing down. When Merritt was finished, Iris said, quietly, "He is not pressuring me. He is pressuring the people who have been kind to me. He is," said Merritt. "Do they know why? They know why. Every one of them. And every one of them has told me, before I wrote out here, that I was not to describe it to you as if it were a favor being done for you. It is not. Pearlie told me to say." His exact words, Miss Callum. "Tell her the smithy has weathered worse than a stagecoach line, and tell her not to make herself sick over my books." Iris was silent for a long moment. Then she said, "Merritt, sit down with me at the table." Merritt Vane sat down. Iris brought 2 cups of coffee. She opened her ledger and she turned it around so that Merritt could read the page, and on the page were the names, 10 of them, all 10, and beside each name was a small notation in Iris's hand of what that person had accepted from her in kindness during the summer. Carrots, beans, thyme, coffee, a stone's step. "They have given me more than I have given them," said Iris. "By any measure I can put in this book. I will not have them broken over my valley." "They know that," said Merritt, "and they are asking you not to break your valley over them." Which is, in case you had not noticed, exactly the same request. Iris looked at Merritt Vane across the small pine table for a long, slow moment. Then, in the smallest voice she had used all summer, she said, "Merritt, what do I do?" Merritt Vane took a slow, careful sip of her coffee. She set the cup down. She said, "Miss Callum, you do the thing you have already been doing. You keep the water running. You honor the promises you have made to the ranchers who came to you honestly. And you let those of us who have been kind to you take our own weather. That is not your storm to stand under. That is ours. We chose it before we chose you." Iris did not answer. She did not, that afternoon, cry. She did, however, at the door when Merritt Vane climbed back into her cart, put her hand once on Merritt Vane's forearm and squeeze it, and Merritt Vane did not require any words to know what the pressure of that hand meant. Day 218. The Reckoning. It came as Iris had known it would at dawn. She had risen at 3 in the morning that day. She had banked the fire. She had put on her plainest wool skirt and her heaviest cotton blouse and her father's old jacket over the blouse and her boots. The boots she had walked the valley in the whole summer, cracked at the heels but sound at the soles. She had put her ledger inside a canvas satchel and slung the satchel over her shoulder. She had put her mother's red-covered notebook inside the top of the satchel, and the folded letter from Deacon Ross's second offer, and the signed page from Whitfield Ames. She had put her father's whetstone in her apron pocket, and her copper measuring cup in the other pocket, and she had walked out into the dark and stood at the head of her channel and waited. They came at first light, for riders again, but not on the ridge this time. Down the wash, Deacon Ross in the lead on a good gray horse, Halden Poole on the chestnut, Bull Meacham on a bay, Jacob Ellery on the black. They rode at a walk. They stopped at the fence line. Deacon Ross dismounted first. He walked to the fence. He did not raise his voice. "Miss Callum, Mr. Ross, I have come to speak with you about the offer. You have my written answer. I have your written answer. I have also, in the last 4 days, come into possession of certain information regarding the finances of certain of your acquaintances in Silver Fork, which I believe you may find it useful to hear before repeating that answer." He was, at that moment, standing on one side of a wire fence, and Iris was standing on the other, and between them ran the channel Ephraim Kell had dug, the water going by at its slow, steady walking pace, cold and clean and unhurried, the way it had gone by every hour of every day for the last 110 days. Iris looked at Deacon Ross across the fence, and she said, in a voice pitched exactly for him to hear and no one else, "Mr. Ross, I have already been told what you have done to Pearlie Coombs and to Cornelia Vance and to Laureen Hoff. I have been asked, by all 3 of them and by Merritt Vane, not to consider their difficulties as any part of my decision. I am honoring that request. My answer is unchanged. The valley is not for sale." Ross was silent for a long moment. Then, in a voice pitched exactly as low as her own, he said, "Miss Callum, I do not believe you understand how much difficulty a man like me can bring to the town of Silver Fork if he decides to." Iris said, "Mr. Ross, I do not believe you understand how much difficulty the town of Silver Fork can bring to a man like you if it decides to. And Mr. Ross, this is the last thing I will say to you across this fence. I do not believe you have properly reckoned how much of that difficulty has already, in the last 4 days, been decided upon." She turned her head, once, slowly, and looked back toward the wash trail. There, in the pale gray light, coming up the trail on foot in a loose informal group, were 9 people. Amos Dell in the lead, Merritt Vane beside him, Pearlie Coombs, Cornelia Vance, Laureen Hoff, Ada Barlow,
Fredrik Nye,
Winnie Ross, Ephraim Kell, who had ridden in from 2 Forks the night before and had slept in Iris's shelter without her knowing until she had opened the door at 3. They stopped at Amos Dell's small gesture, 10 yards behind Iris. They did not speak. They stood. Deacon Ross looked at his own younger sister at the back of the group. Winnie Ross looked back at him. She did not soften her face and she did not raise her chin. She did not need to. It was already raised. Deacon Ross was silent for the longest slow moment of that morning. His face, Iris watched it, did the thing a face does when a man realizes he has made a very expensive error, not of judgment but of imagination. He had imagined a woman alone. There was not a woman alone at the fence. There had not been since day 51. He turned. He mounted the gray horse. He said, without heat, over his shoulder, "This is not over, Miss Callum." "It is, Mr. Ross," said Iris. "Not tomorrow, not next month, but by the winter it is." He rode away up the wash. Halden Poole followed. Bull Meacham followed him. Jacob Ellery, at the bend, hesitated for the length of a breath before he turned his horse and rode after them. The 9 people behind Iris did not move until the 4 riders were entirely out of sight. Then Amos Dell stepped up beside her at the fence and he said, quietly, "Miss Callum, if it is agreeable to you, I will ride into 2 Forks this afternoon and speak with Whitfield Ames about filing a formal statement of what has happened here this morning." "It is agreeable, Sheriff," said Iris. She did not, in that moment, allow herself to look at any of the 9 people behind her. She looked at the water in the channel, going by, cold and clear and unhurried, as it had gone by every hour of every day, and she said, in a voice pitched for herself and for the valley, well, that is that. The mule, at the corner of the shelter, blinked twice. The night after the reckoning at the fence, Iris did not sleep in her shelter. She sat, instead, at her small pine table with the door open onto the yard and the fire banked low in the hearth. She wrote in the ledger for a long time. She wrote the names of the 9 people who had come up the wash trail in the pale gray light. She wrote what each of them had risked in coming. Pearlie Coombs the smithy, Cornelia Vance the post office, Laureen Hoff the standing account, Ada Barlow the schoolhouse position, Frederick Nye the assistant preachership, Winnie Ross her own family, and beside each name she wrote a number in dollars of what she estimated the risk had cost or would cost each of them. The numbers added up to more than the $6,000 Deacon Ross had offered her for the valley. She looked at the total for a long moment. She did not, in that moment, do the calculation that a lesser person might have done. The calculation of whether it would be fairer, in the end, to accept the offer, distribute the money among the 9, and let the valley go back to being a barren line on a surveyor's map. She had already, weeks before, refused that calculation on its own merits. She refused it a second time now with the same clarity, and this time she also refused it on their behalf. The 9 people had not stood at her fence line for the price of a bushel of carrots. They had stood at her fence line for a reason none of them, if pressed, would have been able to put into a single sentence, which was that a woman with a valley she had earned by walking it, alone in April at first light, was not, in the moral accounting of a small frontier town, someone the town was going to allow to be broken by a man who had never once, in his 11 years in Silver Fork, walked a fence line himself. She closed the ledger. She banked the fire further. She sat at the door for another hour and watched the pale ridge in the moonlight and the mule chewing sage at the corner of the shelter and the shape of the channel water going by, silver in the moon, at its slow, steady walking pace. Day 224. Amos Dell rode back from Two Forks with Whitfield Ames's formal statement. He rode into the yard at 4 in the afternoon and dismounted at the shelter door and handed the folded statement to Iris without dismounting his hat. Miss Callum. Ames has written it plainly. He has stated, in a document I would be prepared to submit to any county court in the state, that the water rights on this parcel are, in law and in fact, yours, and that any challenge to that fact is unsound on its own merits and, in his opinion, made in bad faith. He has signed it twice, once as the surveyor and once as a citizen, and he has forwarded a copy of the same to the county clerk in his own hand. Iris read the statement. It was 3 pages in Whitfield Ames's small, cramped hand, and every word of it was as flat and unadorned as the man himself. "Sheriff," said Iris, "you will have coffee before you ride back." He had coffee. They sat at the pine table. Amos Dell did not speak much. He did, however, before he rose to go, say the following. Miss Callum. Ross has, since the morning of day 218, sent no more men to the ridge. Halden Poole has ridden into Silver Fork every day of the last 4 asking small questions in a voice pitched a shade lower than he used to use. Bidwell the clerk has not been seen at the assay office since Tuesday. It is my professional assessment that Ross is preparing to make one further offer of a different kind, and that when he makes it, you will find it easier to accept than you found the last one. Because he cannot walk this back publicly. He can only walk it back in a way that lets him call it business. Iris nodded, slowly. She thanked the sheriff. She watched him ride away up the wash. Then she stood in the yard for a long moment with her arms folded, and the thing she was feeling was not victory and not its cousin, but something quieter. A small, clear certainty that had the shape of a well that had been dug and was now, at last, holding water at the top. She turned. She went inside. She wrote in the ledger, Day 224. Whitfield Ames statement received. Ross will offer in a different form within the fortnight. Day 234. By early September, Deacon Ross had withdrawn the county survey challenge. Not publicly. A man like Deacon Ross did not withdraw publicly, but through the same clerk Bidwell who had brought him the original news, the challenge was quietly marked in the county records as noted and set aside, and the survey filed by Whitfield Ames was quietly marked in the same records as accepted and controlling. By the middle of September, the pressure that had been placed on Pearlie Coombs and Cornelia Vance and Laureen Hoff was quietly lifted. The stagecoach line rehired Pearlie for its winter routes. The postmistress's second cousin stopped visiting her at home. The bill on Laureen Hoff's standing account was, without explanation, reissued at its former monthly increments. None of these things was accompanied by an apology. Deacon Ross did not, as far as Iris ever heard, use the word sorry in any sentence he spoke about her that autumn. Deacon Ross was not a man who was going to be redeemed in the fullest sense of the word. He was a man whose calculus had shifted, and he was, in his own limited way, going to honor the shift. The shift honored, he sent Halden Poole out to the valley one last time, on the 14th of September, in the late afternoon, alone on the chestnut. Halden Poole stopped his horse at Iris's fence, and he did not dismount. He sat there with the last light on his face, and he looked at the channel water running past him, and he looked at Iris, and he said, in a voice that had lost most but not all of its earlier weight, "Mr. Ross has a proposition." "I have heard Mr. Ross's propositions. You have not heard this one." Iris folded her arms. "Then say it." Halden Poole took a folded piece of paper from inside his coat. He did not unfold it. He said, "Mr. Ross proposes to purchase, at a fair market rate to be agreed by both parties, water rights of first call on your channel during the 6-week dry period of any summer in which he requires them, for a term of 10 years, with the water rights to revert to your estate at the end of that term without further claim. He proposes to pay this rate in full, in cash, in advance of each summer. He proposes that the terms be recorded with the county and signed off in the presence of Sheriff Amos Dell. He proposes that this arrangement is a business arrangement between two ranchers of the county, and that no further inquiries about your parcel will be made by him, or by any of his men, or by any clerk in his employ, or by any surveyor under his commission, from the date of the signing to the end of the term. Iris looked at Halden Poole across the fence for a long, slow moment. She thought about it. Not fear now, not its cousin, not the third thing she had felt on day 183. Something else. A fourth thing along the same road, which had the shape of stillness and none of its softness. She recognized it and she named it privately, the moment at which a person decides not whether they have won, but what winning is going to be permitted to look like. She had won. That was decided. What she was choosing now, standing at her fence with the last light on her face and Halden Poole on his chestnut in front of her, was the shape her winning was going to take in the county's memory. She could refuse the offer. She could hold Deacon Ross out entirely from her water for the rest of his life. She could make him ride, in every dry summer, 100 miles east to the river to keep his herd alive. She could also, and this was the thing she had learned in the summer, and which her mother's notebook had not taught her because her mother had not, in her short life, been given the chance, say yes on her terms, at her price, in her handwriting, at her fence. She said, "Mr.
Paul.
Ride back and tell Mr. Ross this. I will consider a 10-year contract of the kind you describe, at a rate to be agreed. I will sign it in the presence of Sheriff Amos Dell and Mrs. Merritt Vane and Mr. Pearlie Coombs, all three of them at once, in the sheriff's office in Silver Fork. I will require, as a condition of the signing, that Mr. Ross also sign, at the same table, a written apology to Mrs. Vane, to Mrs. Vance, to Mrs. Hoff, and to Mr. Coombs for the difficulties recently visited upon them at his direction. The apology need not be public. It need only be in writing, in Mr. Ross's own hand, and it need only be witnessed by the same three people." Halden Poole was silent. Then he said, "He will not do the apology. Then he will not have the water." Halden Poole looked at her. He looked at the channel. He looked for a long moment at the small housing over the well by the shelter, and Iris understood, in that long moment, that Halden Poole had, at last, calculated the length of Deacon Ross's shadow and had found it, in comparison to hers, wanting. "I will tell him," said Halden Poole. "I will tell him tonight." He turned the chestnut. At the bend he did not look back. Day 241. Deacon Ross signed the apology. He signed it, as Iris had required, in the presence of Sheriff Amos Dell and Mrs. Merritt Vane and Mr. Pearlie Coombs, at the sheriff's small pine table in the small pine office. He did not, at any point during the signing, meet Iris's eye. He signed the contract for the water rights immediately after, 10 years, at a rate they had negotiated to within $1 the previous afternoon. He tipped his hat to the sheriff. He tipped his hat, briefly, to Merritt Vane. He did not tip his hat to Iris. He walked out of the office and he mounted his gray horse and he rode away up the main street of Silver Fork, and Iris, standing at the sheriff's window, watched him ride away and did not smile. Halden Poole was outside the sheriff's office on his chestnut. He did not follow Deacon Ross. He waited until Iris came out on the sidewalk, and he touched his hat to her. A small, deliberate gesture, and he said, in a voice pitched only for her, "Miss Callum, I would like, at some future date, to ask you whether you would consider hiring a foreman for your ranch when you have expanded to the point of needing one. I am not asking today. I am telling you that when you are ready, I would like to be considered. On honest terms." Iris looked at Halden Poole. She thought about it for the length of a breath. Then she said, "Mr. Poole, when I am ready you may write to me. I will consider you." He touched his hat again. He rode away. That night, in her shelter at her small pine table, Iris opened her ledger. She wrote, on the page for day 241, Ross apology signed and witnessed. Water contract signed and witnessed. Rate fair. Poole applied by intention if not by letter. This is the end of the first year. She closed the ledger. She put her father's whetstone on top of it as a paperweight. She sat by the small fire for a long moment. Then she took her mother's red-covered notebook down from the pine chest and she opened it for the first time in 2 months. She did not read it. She simply held it, closed, in her lap, and she said, out loud, to the empty shelter and to the pale ridge and to the water still running past the fence and to the woman who had, for years dead, still known enough to leave a book behind, Mother. It held. Outside the wind moved south down the valley, cool and dry, carrying, as it always did now, the faint distinct scent of wet stone. The mule was asleep standing up at the corner of the shelter, one ear cocked to the wind. Day 244. 3 days after the signing at the sheriff's table, the postmistress Cornelia Vance rode out to the valley on her own horse in the middle of the afternoon. She had never, in the whole of the summer, ridden out to Iris's ground. She dismounted at the fence line and she walked the last 20 yards on her own 2 feet with her horse's reins in her hand, and she stopped at the shelter door. She held out an envelope. It was thin, cream-colored, and sealed with a red wafer, and the hand on the front was Deacon Ross's. "He asked me to deliver it personally," said Cornelia Vance. "He said it was not for the postbag. He wanted, in his own words, no clerk between his hand and yours." Iris took the envelope. She turned it over. She looked at Cornelia. "Have you read it?" "No, Miss Callum. He asked me not to. I would not have read it in any case." Iris broke the wafer. She unfolded the letter. She read it standing at the shelter door with Cornelia Vance holding her horse's reins and the wind moving south down the valley in the late afternoon. The letter was 4 short lines. It said, in Deacon Ross's own careful hand, "Miss Callum, I have signed the apology because the terms required it. I have also, in the last 4 days, done considerable thinking about the shape of your operation and the shape of my own. I would like, at your convenience, to propose one further business matter. It concerns the winter feed my herd requires and the winter feed a piece of ground on your east fence can produce. If you would consider a proposal of that shape, I will call at any hour you name. Yours, Deacon Ross." Iris folded the letter along its single crease. She looked at Cornelia Vance across the shelter door. "Mrs. Vance, will you carry a reply?" "I will." Iris wrote the reply then and there, at the small pine table, in 3 short lines. It said, "Mr. Ross, I will receive your proposal at 9 in the morning on the 11th of October, at the sheriff's office in Silver Fork, in the presence of Sheriff Dell and Mrs. Vane. Yours, Iris Callum." She sealed it. She handed it to Cornelia Vance. Cornelia Vance mounted her horse and rode back to town at a walk, and Iris stood at the shelter door for a long moment after she was gone and did not, in that moment, allow herself the small private smile she had inherited from her mother. She was not, on the afternoon of day 244, quite finished with Deacon Ross yet. Day 254. Ross came to the sheriff's office at 9 in the morning on the 11th of October. He came alone. He proposed, at the sheriff's small pine table, to buy at a fair market rate to be agreed, the winter cut of hay from the east fence pasture of Iris's valley, on a 5-year contract, in exchange for a small annual sum in advance. He proposed the terms plainly. He did not, at any point in the meeting, look Iris in the eye. Iris agreed to the terms with 2 adjustments. First, that the annual sum in advance be paid, not to her, but to a joint account she named, an account she had, on the advice of Merritt Vane, opened the previous week at the bank in Two Forks in the shared names of Miss Iris Callum and Mrs. Merritt Vane, for the express purpose of holding funds that were not to be spent by either woman without the written agreement of both. Deacon Ross did not question the arrangement. He signed. Second, that the hay be cut by hands hired from Silver Fork at Iris's choosing, not by hands under Ross's payroll. Ross agreed to that also, though he took perhaps a fraction of a second longer to do so. They signed. Ross tipped his hat to the sheriff and to Merritt Vane and rode away. Iris walked out of the sheriff's office beside Merritt. On the sidewalk, in the low autumn sun, Merritt looked at Iris and said, in her flat, unhurried way, "Miss Callum, the account will not be spent lightly."
No, Merritt.
"The account will not be spent at all until the 5th year, and then it will be spent on one thing." "On what?" "On a building," said Iris. Merritt Vane did not ask what building. She had, by the 11th of October, learned that Iris Callum's answers to that kind of question tended to arrive by their own timing. Year 1. Year 2. Year 3. The first 3 years passed the way long, careful years pass on land that has been given water. Slowly at the pace of a working day, quickly at the pace of a whole life. Iris expanded the channel by another 200 feet in the 2nd year, and by another 400 in the 3rd, and by the 4th year the channel ran the full length of her south fence and turned east along the boundary and watered 140 acres of her own ground and, by written contract, another 80 of Judson Crofts beyond the fence. She hired Silas Marne as her first year-round hand in the 2nd year, and paid him a wage his sister Grace Marne considered generous and his employer, Iris, considered fair. She built a proper cabin, pine boards over a stone foundation her own 2 hands had helped set. In the 3rd year, she hired, in the 4th year on written terms, Halden Poole as her ranch foreman. Halden Poole, on honest terms, was not the man he had been at the county land office. He worked hard. He kept books that Iris could audit at any hour without warning. He did not, ever, work a day for Deacon Ross again. He married, in the 6th year, Grace Marne, who had built the stone step at Iris's original shelter door in the first summer and who now, at 22, ran the vegetable operation that had grown out of Iris's original garden along the wash. Grace and Halden built a small house of their own a 1/4 mile up the wash and raised, over the next 14 years, 5 children whose names Iris entered into her ledger the day each of them was born. Year 7. Deacon Ross died. He died of a stroke in his own bed in Silver Fork in the winter at the age of 61. He had honored the water contract every year of the 7 years of its running to date. He had not, at any point after the signing at the sheriff's table, spoken to Iris again. She did not attend the funeral. She sent, by way of the postmistress Cornelia Vance, a modest wreath of dried thyme and blue ribbon-tied evergreen to the widow. The widow received the wreath. The widow, Iris later learned, wept for a full minute holding it, and did not, in the weeping, offer any explanation of the weeping to anyone. Deacon Ross's ranch operation passed to his younger brother, who was neither Deacon nor a Ross in temperament, a plain steady man named Ferris, and Ferris, in the 3rd month of his management, rode out to Iris's fence line and asked plainly whether the water contract could be extended, on its existing terms, from 10 years to 20. Iris considered the request. She said yes, on the condition of 2 small adjustments to the rate that reflected the increased use over time. Ferris Ross agreed to the adjustments at the sheriff's table in Silver Fork with the same 3 witnesses, and the extension was recorded in the county book that same afternoon. Winnie Ross, Deacon's younger sister, who had, on day 141 of the 1st year, walked into Merritt Vane's store and made herself known, never married. She moved out to the valley in the 9th year, at Iris's own invitation, and she lived in the small stone cottage Iris built for her 100 yards east of the main cabin, and she taught school there, first to Grace and Halden's 5 children, then to the children of 2 other families who took up land nearby on Iris's recommendation, for the next 31 years. Year 12. The water school was founded. That was what the county records eventually called it. the Callum Valley School of Water Rights and Practical Irrigation, though it was, in its first 10 years, simply a two-room stone building at the head of Iris's channel, in which Iris and Winnie Ross and later Ada Barlow, who retired from the Silver Fork schoolhouse in the 15th year and moved out to the valley to live in a small room off the school, taught the daughters and sons of the county's homesteaders how to site a spring, how to dig a channel, how to draft a water contract that would hold in a county court, and how to negotiate a fair rate for water in a dry summer without breaking the neighbor who needed to buy it. Iris wrote the first draft of the curriculum by hand, in the 14th year, from the pages of her original ledger. The school did not charge tuition to any student born in the county. It charged, from students who came in from farther afield, a small fee that covered board and materials. It graduated, in its first 20 years of operation, 142 students, of whom 61 were young women. Sheriff Amos Dell died in the 17th year. Iris rode into Silver Fork for the funeral in a black wool coat that had been her mother's. Merritt Vane walked with her arm through Iris's from the church to the graveyard. Pearlie Coombs and Cornelia Vance and Laureen Hoff and Ada Barlow and Frederick Nye and Ephraim Kell. Ephraim was 79 by then, still upright, still walking with a level in his coat pocket by habit. All rode or walked in the procession. Iris did not, at Amos Dell's grave, allow herself to cry. She had thanked him, alive, at his last office visit, 3 weeks before, and she considered the thanking already complete. Year 24. Iris and Halden Poole had a conversation. They were at the head of the channel, in the late afternoon, in the fall of a year that had been dry through August and merciful in September. Iris was 46. Halden Poole was 59. He had been her foreman for 20 years by that time. He had not, in any of those 20 years, made a proposal to her of any kind other than professional, and she had not, in any of those 20 years, expected him to. Grace, his wife, was well and living a quarter-mile up the wash. The 5 children were grown, 3 of them married, 2 of them working in the valley beside their parents. Halden Poole took his hat off at the head of the channel and he said, in the plain, unornamented way he now had, Miss Callum, I have been meaning, for about 12 years, to say to you that I am sorry for the way I first came onto your ground. Iris looked at him. She said, Mr. Poole, you said it, in the way you said it, by staying for 20 years and being honest every day of them. I have not held the first summer against you since about the 4th year, and if I am telling you the truth, since about the 3rd. He nodded once. He put his hat back on. That was the whole of the apology. They stood at the head of the channel for another minute and watched the water go by, and neither of them said anything more, and neither of them needed to. Year 32. Iris founded the Callum Valley Water Covenant. It was a document 32 pages, handwritten in Iris's own steady hand, witnessed by 7 signatures at the county courthouse, that placed, in perpetuity, the water rights of Callum Valley into a legal trust that could not be sold, subdivided, or granted exclusively to any single ranch or family, including her own. The covenant designated the Callum Valley School as its administrator. It named, in its first paragraph, the school's founding principle, that no household within a 10-mile radius of the valley should ever, in any dry summer or in any wet one, be refused a fair share of the water at a price the household could afford, and that no household within that radius should ever, in any dry summer or in any wet one, be allowed to draw more than its fair share at the expense of another. She signed the covenant on the morning of the 4th of April, 32 years to the day after she had signed the deed. Winnie Ross witnessed.
Grace Marne Poole witnessed.
Ada Barlow, 83 years old, still upright, still living in the small room off the school, witnessed. Ferris Ross's son, who had inherited the Eastern Ranch and had honored every water agreement his family had signed since his uncle's death, witnessed. Merritt Vane, 91 and still keeping the general store though only for 2 hours a day, witnessed. Ephraim Kell would have witnessed. Ephraim Kell had died in the 28th year, in his sleep in 2 Forks, with his brass level on the nightstand beside him. His signature had been added to the document in advance, at his own written request, for months before his death. Merritt Vane died in the 33rd year. Iris did not, at Merritt's grave, allow herself to cry either. She had thanked Merritt at Merritt's own kitchen table 2 weeks before, over a cup of coffee, and Merritt had said, with the flat and impersonal patience of a woman who had seen everything a small town could produce, Miss Callum, There is no thanking to do. You brought us water. We did the ordinary thing, which was to stand at your fence when it was time to stand. We are even. Winnie Ross died in the 37th year. Ada Barlow died in the 38th. Halden Poole died in the 41st at 76 of a heart that had been steady for 4 decades and stopped without warning at the head of the channel his hands had helped. In the 10th year, deepened by another foot. Grace Marne Poole died in the 43rd year, of the same disease that had taken her mother. Iris lived alone in the main cabin after that, though alone was not the correct word. She lived among the memory of everyone who had stood in the yard on the morning of day 218, and among the working presence of Grace and Halden's children and grandchildren, and among the daily working presence of Silas Marne's youngest daughter Unia, who had trained at the water school and now ran the ranch operation in her 50s as competently as her father had run it in his 40s. Iris died in the 57th year of the valley. She was 79. She died in the small back bedroom of the main cabin, in the middle of an April afternoon, with the door open onto the yard and the sound of the channel water moving past the fence, and with her mother's red-covered notebook and her father's whetstone and her own leather ledger, all three, laid on the coverlet beside her at her own request. She died without any visible pain. Unia Marne was with her. Unia Marne closed her eyes when the moment came. Iris was buried on the west edge of the valley, under the dead cottonwood at the northwest corner, which had, at some point in the 3rd decade, put out a single new branch and, in the 4th decade, put out 4 more. By the year of Iris's burial the cottonwood was, again, a living tree though a young one, and every child of the water school had, at some point in their years there, been taken by their teacher to sit under it and read from a small worn book bound in red cloth. The book, by the arrangement of Iris's own written will, was left in a locked cabinet in the water school's first room, and any child of the school who wished to sit with it, unaccompanied, for an hour on a spring afternoon was permitted by the standing rule of the school to do so. Unia Marne, who lived to 84, was buried beside Iris in the 51st year after Iris's own death. By that time the water school was known throughout 3 states. By that time the Covenant had held through 14 droughts, 6 changes in county law, 2 attempts at private challenge, and 1 very brief attempt in the 60th year, by an out-of-state syndicate to purchase the valley entire and dismantle the trust. The out-of-state syndicate withdrew its offer unpublicly, after receiving a letter from the school's then administrator, Unia Marne's oldest granddaughter, a woman named Elsbeth Marne after Iris's mother, that ran, in Elsbeth Marne's own steady hand, to 5 pages, and that ended with a single quoted sentence from Iris Callum's own ledger. A sentence Elsbeth Marne would not paraphrase and did not need to explain, set in quotation marks as a matter of the Covenant's own record. That single sentence had been written in Iris's ledger on day 108 of the first year, and it had not been said out loud in the 60 years since. It was permitted, in this one late instance, to travel outside the valley on Iris's behalf, in Elsbeth Marne's hand, to a place Iris had never seen, in a letter Iris would not read. Held. Year 4. The rye harvest came in at 42 bushels per acre in the 4th year, a yield that Boaz Trent, when he came out to inspect it, called the finest first-decade rye stand he had ever seen on ground west of the Two Forks watershed. Iris did not, in the 4th-year ledger, allow herself a single sentence of self-congratulation. She wrote only, at the bottom of the page for the harvest week. Rye came in. Trent pleased. Water held. Year 5. The building fund from the joint account with Merritt Vane had grown, by the arrangements of the hay contract with Deacon Ross, to a sum sufficient to construct a 2-room stone building at the head of the channel. Iris hired a stonemason out of Two Forks, a man Ephraim Kell recommended, whose name was Adrian Voss, to work through the summer, and by the end of the 5th year the building stood at the head of the channel, its foundation laid on the same limestone shelf beneath which the first fisher carried water out of the Pale Ridge. Iris did not tell the county what the building was for. The county records, in the 5th year, described it simply as an outbuilding on the Callum parcel. In the 6th year, when Iris opened it as a school, for 1 student, the eldest of Silas Marne's children, whose name was Marta, the county records were amended to describe it as a private tutorial house. In the 7th year, when the enrollment reached 6, the amendment was struck. In the 8th year, when Ada Barlow began to visit twice a week to teach reading and figures alongside Iris's own instruction in the practical work of the water, the county simply stopped attempting to describe the building. Small institutions in the country, Iris had noticed, tended to grow larger than the vocabulary the county had for them. Year 10. Winnie Ross moved out to the valley for the first time. She was 39. Her brother had been dead 3 years by then. She had, in those 3 years, cared for their mother in Silver Fork through a long, slow decline, and their mother had died in the 9th spring. Winnie had, in the summer following her mother's funeral, ridden out to the valley one afternoon in her morning wool and had stood at Iris's fence line with her hat off, and she had said, in a voice that did not tremble but was nonetheless not entirely steady, "Miss Callum, I have no more people in Silver Fork. I would like, if it is agreeable to you, to come out and teach here." Iris built the stone cottage for Winnie 100 yards east of the main cabin that same autumn. Winnie moved in the following spring and lived there for 31 years and taught school at the water school for 29 of those years, and she was buried in the 12th month of the 37th year, in the small valley graveyard on the west edge under the cottonwood, beside her mother's older friend Merritt Vane, and later beside Iris herself. Year 14. The first outside student arrived. He was a boy of 15 from an eastern county 3 days' ride, sent by a father who had heard, at market, of a small teaching institution on the far side of the Pale Ridge where a woman with a channel dug by hand taught practical water. The boy's name was Ezekiel Frome. He stayed at the school for 2 years. He returned to his father's ground and, in the 4th year after his return, dug a channel of his own on a shelf his father had, until then, considered dry. The channel produced water. The boy wrote to Iris in the 7th year after his return. His letter, folded carefully, was placed by Iris in a small cedar box in the cabinet at the school, labeled in her own hand, "Student Letters." First, the cedar box, by the end of Iris's life, held 211 such letters. Year 20. The channel was widened, by Haldenpool's own hand and by Silas Marne's and by 2 of Grace Marnepool's grown sons, to twice its original capacity. The additional water fed a new pasture on the east fence and, by written contract, an additional 40 acres of Judson Croft's grandson's land east of the ridge. Judson Croft himself had died in the 16th year, at 82, in a bed his wife had held his hand across for the last week. His grandson honored the water agreement, and its 2nd and 3rd renewals, and his own son honored the 4th. Year 25. The covenant was drafted for the first time, 6 years before its final signing. Iris drafted it in the winter, at the small pine table over 4 months, with Winnie Ross seated across from her and reading each draft aloud in a voice pitched exactly for editing. She rewrote the whole document 7 times in the 4 months. She would rewrite it 11 more times over the following 7 years before she was satisfied enough to submit it. Year 32. The covenant was signed and filed. That year is described earlier in these pages. Stood and it holds still. Year 45. Iris turned 67. She walked, for the last time, the full length of her north fence line at first light, one morning in early April, on the anniversary of the day she had ridden out of Silver Fork with $17 in coins. She stopped at the 4 leaning fence posts she had, in the first summer, dug deeper and packed with stones. All 4 were still standing. She stopped at the length of 40 feet where the wire had, in the first summer, been cut clean. The splice she had made, the one she had not been proud of, was still holding. She did not, that morning, kneel at the base of the south ledge. Her knees were not the knees they had been in year 1. She stood at the base of the ledge in the pale early light, and she put her palm on the cool underside of the stone the way she had put it there in April of 1889, and she stood there for a long moment, and she said, in a voice pitched only for the ledge and the water beneath it, "You held. Thank you." She walked back to the cabin. She wrote in the ledger, the same leather ledger, now bound at the spine with a strip of oiled canvas she had sewn on herself in year 12. A single line, year 45. April 4th. Walked the fence. Water held. That was the last entry she wrote in the ledger. In the following 12 years, she added only 3 additional lines, all of them in a smaller and more careful hand, and none of them describing the work of the valley. Only, in each case, the name of a person who had died and the date the person had died, so that the ledger itself, by the end, would carry the deaths as well as the days. She died, as noted earlier, in the 57th year of the valley. She was buried under the cottonwood on the west edge. The cottonwood, which had put out 1 new branch in year 12 and 4 more in year 24, put out. In the spring of the year after Iris's death, an unusual number of new shoots along its lower trunk. Nobody in the valley remarked on it publicly. Everyone in the valley noticed. The water school still stands. The channel still runs. The cottonwood on the west edge, which by any accounting should have been a stump of ash by now, still lives. An old tall tree with a hollow at the base and a rope swing hung one summer by a great-great-granddaughter of Grace Marne Poole. On a rope Silas Marne's own grandson had braided in the workshop behind the ranch house. The valley itself is quiet, most days. The wind still moves south down it, cool and dry, carrying, as it has for 140 years now, the faint, distinct scent of wet stone. Silver Fork itself is a different town. Smaller than it was, then larger, now smaller again, the way towns on the far edge of a slow country move over time, and the courthouse still holds, in a cedar drawer on the second floor, the original signed page from Whitfield Ames's Walk of the Valley on the 11th of August, and the original signed covenant from the 4th of April of the 32nd year, and in a smaller drawer beneath, the original folded deed that Iris Callum carried in her apron pocket on the wagon board on the morning she rode out of town with $17 and a copper cup. Unia Marne's granddaughter, Elsbeth Marne, who wrote the letter, is buried on the east edge of the valley now, under a small stone with only her name and 2 dates on it. There is nothing in the county records to say she was extraordinary. There is nothing on the stone to say she was extraordinary. The school she administered for 29 years is on record as a small teaching institution of modest budget and average enrollment. The valley is on record as a productive ranch operation with a working covenant. That is how the valley chose, in the end, to remember its own worth. Not in grand markers, in steady water still running. If you ever ride southeast out of Silver Fork on a spring morning, and you cross the Pale Ridge and look down into the wide bright bowl of the valley below you, you will see, at the base of the south wall, a channel of water running slow and cold and unhurried through short grass and rye. You will see a small stone school beside it. You will see, on the west edge, a single tall cottonwood with a rope swing. You will not see, unless you walk up the trail to the graveyard, the small stone that says Iris Callum, born 1866, died 1945. You will not need to. She is in the water. And if you keep riding southeast, past the valley over the second ridge into the long dry country that opens beyond it, you will come in a day and a half to another homestead, on another patch of ground the county surveyors once wrote off with a single word. There is a woman there too. She is younger than Iris was. She has not yet found her water. But she has, in her apron pocket, a folded page in a hand that is not her own. And on the page is a sentence in a hand she has come to trust more than her own. And she is walking her ground at first light with a copper cup. That is another story. The rye kept growing. That woman's name, the one southeast, past the second ridge in the long dry country, is not yet in these pages. She rode out of a town called Mercer's Reach on a day in early spring with a small chestnut mare, a folded page in her apron pocket, and a copper cup she had inherited from a woman she had never met. The page was in Iris Callum's own hand, dated 3 years before Iris's death, and it had passed, by a route that would take a whole other telling to describe, from the cedar cabinet in the water school to a saddle horn to a farmer's wife to a young woman in Mercer's Reach who had, at 17, been laughed at in the same way and by the same kind of men. The page said, in Iris's own steady hand, only this: the valley's people quit on are the ones that hid their water. Look under the ledges. Look where the ground is warmer than the air. Do not sell. That was the whole page. The young woman rode out on a day in early spring with the page folded twice and pressed against the inside pocket of her apron over her ribs. She rode into a piece of country the county had, that year, marked on its map with 2 adjectives, dry and unpromising, and she walked the fence of a claim her aunt had left her the previous winter. She walked it at first light. She stopped at the base of a red sandstone shelf on the south wall. She put her palm on the cool underside of the stone. That is another story, and another year, and another woman with a copper cup at first light. It will be told when its time has come. For now, here in this valley, in this last quiet hour of this telling, the channel still runs at its slow, steady walking pace. The rye is heading in the fields along the wash. The cottonwood on the west edge is still standing. The school is still open, 3 mornings a week, to any child of the country who can ride, walk, or be carried to its door. The rye kept growing.